This story begins in Guantanamo, Cuba. My father, a labor leader, also used to work at the naval base in Guantanamo. This is me as a little child in Cuba, living in Guantanamo, not knowing at that time that giant changes were in the end triggered by this man living in New York in those early years. A man that would radically change not only an island, a continent, and a people by taking his own country and replacing a dictator with a worse dictatorship and creating an entire exodus of people, separation of families, while brutalizing his own people in his home. This is a man that the world often sees through rose-colored glasses, even to this day, but a man who enveloped his island in blood and dictatorship and racism, aided by those who are sometimes admired, and those who were part of the revolution only to become its unwitting martyrs. An island in chains, triggering the largest mass exodus in proportion to any other in the recent history of the world. I remember the long train drive from Guantanamo to Varadero, which is where Cubans would leave from, the flight to the US, and the eventual arrival into New York. As a child, I was raised in Brooklyn by my mom and dad. We had family there. My cousins Rita, Carlitos, my uncle Carlos, my tia Nica, my tio Jose, and my cousins Jorge y Pepe. I was raised there. My mother was a seamstress. She worked her jobs
I want
across
a
the
whole bunch of
street
them, but I lost some of
while
them
keeping
too.
an eye on me. I was into boxing. My dad was into baseball. I was into baseball. What Cuban isn't? And we were giant Mets fans. Shea Stadium was not too far from this place. We used to go to it often. I went to school right across the street. It was a private Catholic school. My mother and father, like most Cubans, believing that education is the key to everything. I enlisted in the Navy when I was 17. My dad believed in service to the country. That opened their doors to us. I was commissioned an officer after going to school at the University of Washington in Seattle. Lived all over Europe. Had my first child, Vanessa. Traveled through Europe, seeing the great masters and kindling my always strong interest in art. My daughter, her first years were spent in Spain, which is where I was stationed, although most of the time I was actually in Beirut, in Lebanon, and all over the Middle East. I remember leaving, and when I came back, she was already walking. Our second daughter, Elise, was born in Monterey. She looked a lot like my father, I thought. Little was I to know that someone in the future would even look more. We lived in Scotland for a while. I love Scotland. A lot of people have said that one of my ancestors, one of my other incantations, must have been as a Scotsman. Open galleries in Washington, two of them, one in Georgetown and one in Bethesda, Maryland. My daughters grew into beautiful women. Both of them used to come visit. This is us sitting at the Bethesda Gallery, trying to be artsy. My daughter Vanessa. There were many years in there where I was writing. I was writing a lot of art criticism. I started a blog, continued working at the gallery, doing art fairs. Washington, D.C. was like a waterfall of ideas and opportunities and meeting people from all over the world that really, really triggered my artistic endeavor. It was through art that I met my wife, Alida. I had curated a show for the WPA at the old warehouse galleries on 7th Street, and we met because of that, not there. For a couple of years, we actually left the area, came back to D.C., where we currently live, of course. Started doing art fairs with the new gallery that I started. My father and mother still living in Florida. My old man, the hero, died without ever returning to his country. He swore never to set foot back in Cuba unless it was free. And unfortunately, he died before it became free, if it ever becomes free, within even my own lifetime. Alida and I got married in 2006, and 3 years later, the first male Campello born into our family since I was born came into being. This, in an interesting way, acted almost like a renewal of a strong bridge between our families. My dad had a grandson. My family had another boy to keep the name going. I was the last and only male Campello, and yet now the door opens for the future as this little guy, seeing here very intent in learning how to open and close doors, becomes the male name holder to our family, as he's been reminded by everyone since the beginning of his life. Miami is always a trigger. Miami is a trigger of Cubanosity, as I refer to it. But Washington has been my own personal trigger for art, for many things. As Anderson has been growing all these years, there's been a renewal in connectivity between families that once were separated by the miles. It's interesting how things like that occur unplanned, even no one knowing that they exist. My mother, still alive in her 90s, perhaps waits for the end. Not her end, but the end of a dictatorship. So maybe she can one day set foot on the island that she left. I hope so. And I hope that these two Cuban Americans will one day may be able to do the same. Thank you, America.